Mary I is remembered as Bloody Mary for the burnings at the stakes of hundreds of people across England during her reign. Tudor England was changed during her short time on the throne as she tried to restore Catholicism to the country, but when Mary came onto the throne it was not easy for her. She was not the successor stated by Edward VI, as that was the Protestant Lady Jane Grey, who became known in history as a 9-day queen, as she was deposed shortly after becoming queen. But many believed Mary was a legitimate heir, and when she took over, she ordered the execution of Lady Jane, later as she believed she was a rebel, who could have been involved in plots against the Catholic monarch. However, Jane did have a husband who, despite also being a young man, was executed for treason and had his head hacked off by an executioner on Tower Hill. Join us today as we look at the horrific execution of the 9-day king, Guilford Dudley, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Lord Guildford Dudley was born around 1535, and his father was the influential John Dudley, the 1st Duke of Northumberland. His family were prominent landowners and courtiers during the Tudor period, as his brother Robert would later become the rumoured love interest of Queen Elizabeth I. Guilford was given a very good humanist education and was raised Protestant, and his father continued to be influential during the reign of King Edward VI, as he was given the title the Lord President of the Council for the young king that helped him rule. This ensured the Dudleys had much power across the land, especially following the execution of Lord Protector Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. John Dudley made changes to much of the king's court, and he became the Grand Master of the king's household, and was involved in raising Edward VI to become a king. He then also became the head of the Privy Council, and with this was practically ruling England as king inside of the country. Guilford was a good young boy, and his father tried to marry him to Margaret Clifford, the surviving daughter of the Earl of Cumberland, but after her father refused this, John Dudley looked for another wife for his son, and then in spring 1553 he was engaged to Lady Jane Grey. Jane was linked to the throne, and she was a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, and when they married on the 25th of May 1553, John Dudley set his plan into action to try and get the pair onto the throne. The wedding was huge and lavish, with huge celebrations, and many European ambassadors came to witness the spectacle. But around 1553, Edward VI, the boy king, became rather unwell. He had a fever and cough that got much worse over the months, and he suffered from tuberculosis. As time went on, Edward became gravely ill, and because of this he would succumb to his illness and later die. But before his death, the king sorted out the succession to bar his half-sister Mary I from the throne. She was seen by Edward as a Catholic meddler, and she had been declared illegitimate, following Henry VIII's split from Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. Edward's other half-sister Elizabeth I was also deemed illegitimate, as her mother Anne Boleyn had been executed inside the walls of the Tower of London years before. But because of this, Edward passed a law that wrote his half-sisters out of the succession, and Lady Jane Grey, the daughter-in-law of John Dudley, was now made the heir. Edward died on the 6th of July 1553, and following this Jane was given the throne. Initially she did not like this, and she did not want to become the queen. 4 days later her reign was announced, and the Duke of Northumberland now had his son as a consort of the queen. He would continue to manipulate Jane and Guilford to get what he wanted, but his son was now the de facto king of England. The royal couple were very young at the time and were teenagers, and the Protestants across the kingdom were likely happy with Jane's appointment, as it was believed they would just continue Edward's work with the church. But it was clear that Guilford did not want to just become a consort. He wanted to become the king and the ruler for himself. This demand put a huge amount of strain on their young marriage, and Jane continued to deny Guilford the power of being a king in his own name. Guilford was made the Duke of Clarence to appease him, but he didn't want to be a duke, he wanted to become a king. The couple had a huge argument, and the Duchess of Northumberland was outraged by what was happening. She banned Guilford from entering Jane's bedchambers, and he was told to go home and leave the Tower of London, but Jane did back him. She asked him to remain at the Tower and court, and to stay by her side, but there were a number of daily meetings that were overseen by Guilford. By doing this he was practically ruling as the king, and he also addressed himself as royalty. The French ambassador referred to him as the new king, and other documents state he was referred to as King Guilford. But cracks then appeared with Lady Jane Grey's claim to the throne. Compared to living descendants of King Henry VIII, Princess Mary and Elizabeth, her claim to the throne was very tenuous and distant, and there were more direct descendants on the throne who should have been there in front of her. Because of this, Mary I would rise up, as she believed she should have been the Queen, and she gathered a number of troops to try and take the throne. Her supporters backed her, and the fact she was a rightful Queen, and the Privy Council who had sworn support to Jane later changed their ideas, and they then backed Mary. With this, they proclaimed Mary I a Queen on the 19th of July 1553, and the reign of the 9-day Queen, Lady Jane Grey, was brought to a short and sharp end. John Dudley had failed to see off Mary's rebellion, and now his son Guilford and the 9-day Queen became prisoners of the Tower of London. They had been preparing for coronation, but now they were state prisoners. The Privy Council fled the Tower, and Jane was moved from the royal apartments inside of the Tower to the gentleman jailers' lodgings. Guilford was imprisoned inside the bell tower, and his brother joined him later. They were kept in different towers, and his father was also held there before he was executed upon Tower Hill. But Mary I sought to punish John Dudley, but it looked like she would spare Guilford and Lady Jane. The pair were accused of high treason and were placed on trial on the 13th of November 1553. They were convicted of high treason and pled guilty. Guilford was convicted of compassing to depose Mary I by sending soldiers to defeat her rebellion, and of proclaiming and honouring Jane as the Queen. Jane was held in better conditions at the Tower than her husband was, and he was only allowed to take a short, brief walk near the bell tower, but Jane could walk wherever she liked. The couple may have briefly spoken during this time, however when Mary I planned to marry the Catholic Prince Philip of Spain, rebellion threatened to break out across the country. Protestants rose up, and it was believed that Jane could be reinstated and be seen as a symbol of the protest. But because of this, it was thought by Mary that it was too dangerous to have Guilford and Jane alive. Through gritted teeth, Mary I ordered their executions. The Privy Council supported this, and Jane and Guilford were told they would lose their heads for their treason. The day before the executions, Guilford asked to meet his wife one more time, but this was refused by Jane, as she worried it would only cause more heartbreak for the pair. But Jane believed they would be reunited in heaven shortly. But around 10 o'clock on the 12th of February 1553, Guilford Dudley was led out of the Tower of London from his cell. He made the short walk north of the Tower to Tower Hill, where the scaffold stood that took the heads of influential Tudor figures, such as Thomas Cromwell and Sir Thomas More. He was to be beheaded by an axeman. The Chronicle of Lady Jane Grey states of his execution that Guilford went out of the Tower to the scaffold on Tower Hill. The Lord Guildford Dudley, son of the late Duke of Northumberland, husband to Lady Jane Grey, daughter to the Duke of Suffolk, who at his going out too, by the hand of Sir Anthony Browne, John Throckmorton and many other gentlemen, praying them to pray for him. The sheriff received him and brought him to the scaffold, where after a small declaration, having no ghostly father with him, he kneeled down and said his prayers, holding up his eyes and hands to God many times, and at last, after he had desired the people to pray for him, he laid himself along in his head upon the block, which was at one strong of the axe taken from him. Guilford Dudley's execution was quick, as his head was taken clean off by the axe and the skilled executioner. Lady Jane was greeted by a sight of horror after she witnessed her husband's remains being taken back into the Tower of London, with his headless corpse then being interred inside the chapel, inside the tower's walls. But shortly after she would also be executed, but she was granted a private execution within the Tower of London. Guilford Dudley was a man who wanted to be the king, and played at the role for a short period of time. However, he was ultimately seen as a treasonous figure. It's believed he suffered from the manipulations of his father, but he was seen as too dangerous to be alive in the eyes of Mary I. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.